Thanks for staying with News at Prime tonight. Well, continuing with our series then of Human Rights Day, today's focus is on racial hierarchies created by apartheid, which continue to plague South Africa. While the majority have now gained political power, socioeconomic disadvantages and perceptions caused by centuries of systemic oppression remain. Well, how can we have constructive conversations about race? That's the question that my guests tonight are going to try and answer. Let me welcome founder and director of L&N Advisors, Lovelyn Nwadeyi, and political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Also joining the conversation is Wits Center for Diversity Studies, Professor Melissa Steyn. Good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for your time. It's such a pleasure to be having this conversation. Let's perhaps begin with the very basics of the relationship between racism and human rights, and perhaps your own reflections of those two themes in contemporary South Africa. Lovelyn, let me begin with you.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy, and good evening to my fellow panelists. So I think the connections between race and human rights are so clear and so obvious, right? One of the things around racism is that it penalizes people who are not white for not being white. And it says because of that, you get treated as less than human, or the basic dignities that would be afforded to other human beings will not be afforded to you. So at a very basic level, I think it's quite easy to identify the connections between racism and human rights, but also identifying the absurdity of it, right? Part of the fallacy of race as a concept is the fact that, you know, there's a way in which we've been indoctrinated to think that you can use this biological feature of someone having more or less pigmentation or more or less melanin, that you can use that biological feature as a way of organizing society, and organizing society in such a way that there are political, social, economic consequences for where you fall in that racial hierarchy. So in my view, I think that those connections are quite obvious and quite clear, and you would think that in the 21st century, this is something we'd have moved past, you know, way beyond. But unfortunately, it's something we still grapple with. And I think the nuances of the conversation today about thinking through what it means to make sense of race and racism in a country where we're not talking about majority-minority dynamics, right, as in the US. We're talking about a black majority country that is still grappling with questions of white supremacy, and how do we make sense of that in this context. So I'll leave it at that for now, and we can pick up later.
Sure, thanks for that, Lovelyn. Sanusha?
Yeah, good evening, Kathy, to my colleagues and viewers. I think what Lovelyn has raised are very important dimensions of the discussion and the debate and the narratives, not just in South Africa, but I think globally as well. I mean, the fault lines between racism, race, and human rights has become really the question of how do you apply it in a manner that is equitable, in a manner that recognizes the person and not what the person's color of their skin is, or what their gender is, or what their ethnicity is, or what their identity is. And I think in the 21st century, we're grappling more with the fault lines than we ever did before. We're looking at the identity of people in a much more narrow parochial context. And I think you can't hide this anymore because of social media. You can't basically pepper over these fault lines in the manner in which it comes across, because you've got your cell phones, you've got your Facebook, you've got your Twitter, and all of this just kind of implodes on these different platforms. And so trying to justify actions on the basis of, we're not sure whether this was a racial attack, we're not sure whether this had to do with racial identity, etc., becomes, the way the optics play out as well is very important, because it comes across in a kind of negative light when you actually have to think about the issues around, who gets caught for criminality and how that projects itself in terms of the narrative, but also the optics. The second thing to to raise in this debate is how do we think about the world in the context of race and human rights? The center of the world is no longer the center that we've always aligned to. The center is becoming very diffuse. The questions of countries that are beginning to challenge this center of political power, economic power, social power, I think is also becoming part of these fault lines of the debate and the discussion. So how do you actually recognize diversity? How do you actually not just recognize diversity, but also acknowledge that you can coexist with diversity? I think becomes critical dimensions. Do we then talk about the projection of when we claim, what you're doing in one country and you try and say, well, I think that's wrong in terms of human rights, but also in terms of race and in terms of class and so forth and gender, but then you keep quiet or you mute it on something else, which is in your national or in your geostrategic interest. And I think in South Africa, we're dealing with this in so many dimensions, just with regard to intergenerational exclusion from institutions, of accessing institutions, like you look at the university structure. That's going to be a difficult leveling of the playing field where you're telling a group of students, be patient, you'll get your turn, but you won't be able to, because leveling the intergenerational inequality issues are so dynamic to identity, to race, to social dynamics, to class, etc. So I think for me, it's also the question of race and class and the fault lines with regard to how that plays out within the context of human rights and what is entrenched in the Constitution, but what is essentially really about the access in practice.
Sanusha, thanks for that. Let me also invite Professor Steyn to respond to that question.
Yes. I think one of the difficulties about the conversations that we have about race is that we've never had a world where we haven't we've never had, in the modern world, we've never had societies that haven't been structured in race. So one of our difficulties is that we're really learning to fly the plane while we're in the air. We're moving forward without knowing exactly how this has to be done, or it's not really been done anywhere else, that we can go somewhere else and find a model that can tell us this is exactly how you need to do it. But we do have a much better understanding of race than we've had in the past. And one of the things we understand very well is the kinds of consequences that it has for people, both for beneficiaries and for the people who've been the recipients of oppression. And so we've got a very good idea of the kinds of legacies that race has left and continues to construct. And we can see that these are human rights violations. If somebody steals something from me, say somebody pulls the necklace off my neck, it's clear that I've been violated. We know that this is a violation. But we haven't got that same clarity in all of our thinking around race, that racism has stolen people's life opportunities. Racism has created structures where it's difficult for people to access human dignity, for them to have the opportunities that they should have had, the opportunities to be able to develop into who they can be, and to continue enduring conditions of poverty, conditions of immiseration. And so I think that we do understand better, but perhaps that's where we need to firm up our connection between race and racism and its consequences and human rights.
Professor Steyn, one of the things that you're raising there is that racism goes beyond an incident that one experiences at the shopping center or even at the filling station, but it is embedded sometimes in societies, and South Africa becomes one of those where racism is systemic. Lovelyn, is the solution then to place emphasis on social and economic rights as a way of correcting that, or how should we be looking for solutions there?
Yeah, so I think the points that both Prof. Steyn and Sanusha have raised really speak to the fact that we cannot divorce human rights from the human experience, right? That's what it comes down to. So whether you are talking about human rights in terms of class and the material implications of being at a particular intersection of being of color and poor and what that means for your day-to-day experience, or if we're talking about gender and what it means to be a woman and poor and of color in this country, or if you're talking about sexuality and what it means to be a lesbian or a gay or a trans person of color who's also poor, right? We can add on and on and on. But the reality is that the experience of human rights is rooted in the body. And so if we're not asking questions about the human experience, the day-to-day navigation of society, we're not going to come to a place where we can have honest conversations about solutions. And I think part of the work that we need to get involved in, both as adults in this country, but even roping in children in this country, is getting to a place where we can be honest, even in our imagination of what solutions can look like. And I think a huge part of that has to do with the ways in which we name things, right? So you think about something like Human Rights Day, and I'm sure there's been, quite a bit of conversation about that, at least on my own social media feeds. You think about something like Human Rights Day, which is safe, which is comfortable, which is palatable to talk about human rights. But actually we need to name Human Rights Day as the Sharpeville Massacre Day. Because there's something about whitewashing history. There's something about erasing and covering up and plastering over history that means that even the process through which we remember becomes tainted, and consequently the process through which we try to implement or imagine solutions is faulty, right? So for me, I think a huge part of this is, as we are having this conversation commemorating what we today call Human Rights Day, we need to ask questions about how are we naming things, right? So we could talk about this public holiday, we could talk about how we talk about police brutality in this country, right? So June 16, we can talk about Youth Day, but it was the day where there were Soweto uprisings, and yes, it occurred in many other parts of the country, but the central piece of that story is about police brutality against young people and against children in this country. And then you look at what happened just 2 weeks ago, where the police did the same thing, right? It just so happens that it's a black police force or black police servicemen, whatever you want to refer to them as, who are perpetuating the same types of violence, right? So if we don't name things properly, we misdiagnose and we, for lack of a better term, we misassess the nature of the situation, and that limits our ability to imagine things. So one of the things for me is that as we name things correctly, we can also start to be honest about where accountability needs to lie, where restitution needs to take place, who needs to do the healing, who needs to do the reconciling, and what's the different pieces of work that we all have to do. A huge part of how we talk about human rights in the South Africa of today is, I think, we create false equivalencies in people's experiences. And it's like, oh, we all have to do something, and just, everybody has an equal share to hold in this. And that's not true. Not in the way our own history is played out. So part of this exercise needs to be naming things, naming them accurately, so that we can imagine solutions in a way that is accurate as well.
We're going to continue our conversation with our three panelists after this quick break. Do stay with us. Well, thanks for staying with us tonight. We're continuing our series of human rights, and today we're focusing on the racial hierarchies created by apartheid, which continue to plague South Africa. Joining us for our conversation tonight is Lovelyn Nwadeyi, who is the founder and director of L&N Advisors, political analyst Sanusha Naidu, and Professor Melissa Steyn from the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. One of the things that Lovelyn was speaking about before we went to the ad break was naming things and giving things the appropriate name. And it's so interesting because when it comes to Human Rights Day, we have a lot of contestation. And I suppose, Sanusha, it's something that has been happening for the 61 years that this commemoration has been taking place, right? Because there's contest over why the name was changed from Sharpeville Day to Human Rights Day. whose history is being included in that acknowledgement, who's being erased in terms of the events that led to the Sharpeville massacre. But perhaps just to put it into why it matters for South Africa today, it's really the difference between whether or not we celebrate Human Rights Day or we use it as a day to commemorate.
Indeed, Kathy, and I think the points made by Lovelyn and of course Professor Steyn is very relevant because of the way we actually interpret human rights. I mean, for me, human rights is every day of the year. It doesn't just have to have a special day. But I think you're also pointing out to the idea that in our historical narrative of our anti-apartheid struggle, there were dates like today, like yesterday, and of course like June 16th, and of course August 9th, and there's so many other dates in the calendar that represent and reflect how important the human rights struggle was in South Africa in terms of pushing back against the anti-apartheid structure, the apartheid structure through the anti-apartheid struggle. I mean, just yesterday, looking at the documentary about the life of Dosi September and the assassination, again, another human rights activist who, again, you know, under the apartheid structure was assassinated, and just looking at how that played out. But I think what's important for us to also think about is this point that you raised about the systemic nature of the way we interpret human rights, both at the level of the institutional nature of the state, but also within our private spaces, within our homes, within our communities, within our societies. Do we talk about it in the way that it should be reflected upon as a honest discussion, as a debate, as a narrative? Do we speak about the rights of people to be able to access particular resources, to be able to enjoy what you call their human rights as entrenched in the Bill of Rights? And I think to a large extent, we don't really do that in private spaces, or whether we do it in our communities, etc. At times, we tend to use a lot of perception to define how we actually perceive other people's human rights. And I think we get caught up in also defining what our communities build up as the discussion around human rights. So, you know, the point about talking about the historical relevance and the reflection of the 21st of March 1960 or 1961, and talking about June 16th, 1976, is really about understanding what those sacrifices were in the name of human rights. And I think very often when we think about that historical narrative, going back to the point that Professor Steyn made about understanding that there's a roadmap here in understanding race and racism and human rights in a better light today, I think we also tend to have these different issues where we become, the question of tolerance becomes a sub question, an important question of how do we tolerate, how do we engage, how do we include these discussions of other people's rights. I mean, it's just simple things. You talked about going to the supermarket and dealing with some of these questions, but I think it's also just responding to the student protest last week and just saying to people, you got to understand where this protest is coming from. This is not just about the fact that we had 1994 and a negotiated settlement. This is about the fact that many people don't really feel that there's a sense of inclusion after 1994. There's a precariat out there. You know, if you read the works of Guy Standing about the precariat class around the world, it's about the right to be included. And I think to a large extent, there's these young people who are saying, I want to be included. I want to be able to exercise these rights, but the institutional architecture of the state actually excludes me based on the way in which the model is defined around inclusion, around access to the institutional spaces, and of course the way in which we've created financial exclusion of all people in the context of their vulnerability and their marginalization. So if I'm sitting in that student protest at Wits or wherever else in South Africa, I'm looking at my parents and I'm asking myself, what do they have to show for their 25 years after democracy? I know people are telling these young people to be patient. How much more patient can they be? Because on the one hand, the narrative is you are the engine of this economy. You're the future of this economic growth. On the other hand, we're saying you got to pay your fees before you even get there. So I think to a large extent, we've got so many institutional spaces, both in the state, in the private sector, in the non-private sector, in the non-state space, that we kind of end up in a situation where we go around in circles around the importance of human rights. But do we actually put it out there in a very real way about how do we create inclusion, how do we create financial inclusion, how do we create gender inclusion? I mean, just look at the gender-based violence that has been happening in the country. Those are rights that are being violated on every single day. Children's rights are being violated every single day. So I think we, at a very difficult period within our post-democratic, post-1994 period. I think we have democracy on the run, so to speak. It's kind of moving in various different spaces. There's reaction to the fact that the state is, the people's rights are, they feel violated. But this is not just in South Africa. It's the world over.
Professor Steyn, I want to also shift the conversation slightly, because Sanusha is talking about inclusion. And one of the things that of course, government will use as a mechanism over just how to go about the process of inclusion are racial classifications. And we have seen vociferous debates in this country over whether these are relevant, should they stay, should they go. Your own reflections perhaps on the role that these classifications play in South Africa today, and the extent to which they are progressive, if you see them as being that way.
Well, I think that that's a good example of what I said before about we're learning to fly while we're in the air. Because the truth of the matter is we really don't know. We have different opinions and different views of this, and obviously everybody wants to reach a point where these racial classifications are not going to matter, are not going to be needed, and are irrelevant. But it's really a difference in terms of how we get there, how we get to that point. Whether we can just do away with them and move on without them. And certainly for myself, doing the work that I do on critical whiteness studies, I would say that that doesn't work, because you allow the systemic nature of racism to actually continue, but you lose your ability to name it and call it out. So for myself, I think also that people have been differently positioned in relation to the issues of racism, to the kinds of consequences it has for people's lives. So the racial wound is not the same for all the different populations who have been oppressed. And so I think we do need to also be able to deal with that in its specificities. And obviously the key point is the question of redress. And how do we do redress? How do we have any handle at all on how far we are progressing if we don't have these categories with which to look, to examine, to interrogate what is happening at different levels in our society. So this is really a matter of strategy, and as I keep saying, I think that nobody really knows, but we can try our best to come up with the best strategies. But may I introduce another issue?
Sure, go for it.
That I think is also